I would forget. But first, the housekeeping. I'm told it's actually quite easy to find the amenities. There's no actual fire drill planned, so if the alarms go off, it's a real one. Yeah, there is somewhere along. So this is where apparently where we need to get out to into the grassed area. That looks really sensible to actually go into the quad of a building which might be on fire with very little exit from the quad. But I don't know. I don't know the rules. Is there a click to get onto the next one? Hopefully the side one. Yeah. Yes. Excellent. Fantastic. So we by all miracles are here. There is that the staircase to get out? Yeah. I think that's the staircase to get out, and there are loos just around that area, so it's not too far away. Yeah, so fantastic. Thanks ever so much for coming. I've been really excited, and I suppose this is all my fault, but I think you will thank me for this. Colin is someone who I would say is absolutely true to the origins of cyber, which is something a lot of people just plainly get wrong. He's held on to it while other people have kind of tried renaming it and called it InfoSec and information assurance. I can't remember how many years ago that I met cyber. In fact, I'm quoted a couple of weeks ago. We had Cyber UK in Manchester, which some of you may or may not have heard of. Has anybody heard of the National Cyber Security Centre? Not? Okay, if you haven't heard of the National Cyber Security Centre, you might have heard of GCHQ. Yeah, GCHQ? Yeah, which of course nobody had heard of until 1990. It's one of these things, everybody knows about it. But anyway, so Colin actually ran the forerunner to that. So, I love being able to say, when people say, oh, do you go to Cyber UK? I just look at them and say, I went to Cyber UK before it was called Cyber UK. And so Colin has run a lot of stuff which is really the foundations of good cyber practice and the kind of the networking and the communications that need to go on, because one thing that has really been shown over the last few weeks with Marks and Spencers and all of these other bad things which are happening in Cyberland is that our adversaries are really good at talking to each other. And of course, we've got to be not as good as, we've got to be even better. But of course, what happens, somebody uses the word cyber, somebody says, I don't understand it, somebody else then defines it, and somebody else then disagrees with the cyber, the definition. And we never get round to things. What Colin is going to talk to you about, there's a book by a guy called James Blick, can't remember how you pronounce it, called Chaos. Came out a number of years ago, and I actually read it from cover to cover at a time where actually I wasn't into reading books. I know academics aren't meant to say that, but there was a period I just went through, I couldn't really be bothered by books. And it wasn't actually the book itself that I want to quote. It's a quote on the cover by a chap called Douglas Adams. Anybody heard of the author Douglas Adams? Famous for? Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, absolutely. And Douglas describes this book, Chaos, as if somebody had found the light switch. And this is what I found. So these are all. So I was doing my PhD. There were all of these ideas about cyber and cybernetics floating around. And then I went to York, to a conference in York that Colin had organised. Colin spoke, and I just thought, yeah, that's how it all fits together. And the good thing about it, as well, is that today Colin is walking in the footsteps of Stafford Beer, one of the great cyberneticists, who of course had a post at Manchester Business School, now the Alliance Manchester Business School. So I'm really pleased about this. He's been an absolutely loyal lecturer. In the old days, when I was young enough to do full days of lecturing myself, I used to pass the buck and think, how can I get out of an hour's teaching? And Colin was very kind enough to come in at least once a year and take some of the weight off my shoulders. I think for all the weight he's taken off my shoulders, he's also added the intellectual weight of more that you will want to find out about after having heard this session. So welcome, Colin. Colin, thanks so much for coming. I'm looking forward to it again.
What piece of work is a man? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like God. Let's assume that you're all human, Or more specifically, let's assume that you all think you're human. Any of you mathematicians? Phew, I've never been entirely sure about that. Let's assume also that you have in mind a clear dichotomy, a binary juxtaposition between, an oppositional juxtaposition between human and machine. You're definitely one of them and you're not one of these, and therefore this one, Danny, is for you. You're definitely not one of those, a robot. Excellent. The word robot enters the English language from a bunch of words nucleated around Slavic terms for drudgery, servitude, serfdom, slavery, subjugation, and so on. Enters the English language as a consequence of a play written in 1920 by this chap. In Chapek's book, in Chapek's play, the robots are not metal. They are not comprised of gears and circuits. They are grown. They're organic. They are defined as robots as a consequence of their sociological substitution to humans. They're slaves. We're growing slaves in vats and tax. And they're indistinguishable from their human counterparts. Is it just me, or does that guy look like Nigel Farage? There we go. And of course the robots rise up and destroy their makers. Good old manifestation of the Frankenstein complex, deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition that the gift of life-giving is reserved unto the God with a capital G, and if humans commit the sin of hubris, then the things they create will rise up and destroy them. Sound oddly resonant with the singularity? Well, it should do. The singularity is based at least as much on a trope rooted in theology as it is in any rational argument. Translated into English, staged by the BBC television, in fact in 1938, again in 1941, again in 1948. However, by 1944, the idea of robots had taken somewhat more menacing corporeal form. Britain was fighting in 1944, by the contemporary account, a robot war on both sides. This, a cruise missile, a drone. Modern, recognisable, upgrade the guidance system, upgrade the propulsion, it's a cruise missile. Funnily enough, because von Braun designed this and he designed the cruise missile essentially, so this is hardly a surprise. However, the defences, the only effective defences against this robot, were themselves robots. Humans, human-piloted aircraft, were useless at bringing the V1 down. This was the only effective mechanism, a computer-controlled anti-aircraft system in 1944. Self-tracking, self-directing radar. When this was initially deployed, the good old British Tommy insisted on putting themselves in the loop more than the system allowed, degraded the performance of the system. The American trainers kicked them out the loop and allowed the system to operate to the maximum extent of its autonomy, and the system thus became effective for its primary purpose, which was shooting down fast-flying aircraft. So, self-tracking radar passes information to C, but D inputs a little azimuth information. C is an electromechanical computer which takes the input data and then programs the guns. The guns self-actuate, self-aim and self-fire. All the human has to do is load them. These cables function as analogues of neurological circuits. They carry the information in electronic form. Even the shells are little mini robots. These things were called variable time. They weren't. They were proximity fuses. They had a Doppler radar that was programmed by the computer embedded in the nose cone. This was not the culmination, but this was an exemplification of a trend which had characterised the conduct of the Second World War. The trend, to summarise in advance, was the substitution of human cognitive and perceptual agency with electromechanical and electronic analogues. Humans were just too darn slow to control these machines, in perceptual terms and in cognitive terms. So this is not musculoskeletal substitution, this is cognitive and perceptual substitution. And it's there from the get-go. And it is exemplified by these monstrous beasts, systems of systems of systems, which surpass the ability of a human to control them without augmentation. At the end of the First World War, it was obvious that the exercise of air power was going to be decisive in the conduct of any future war. Thus a doctrine emerged, according to which, conventional military doctrine, you bombed the what's it out of the civilian population of your adversary, degraded the will to fight, they would withdraw their conventional forces, end of the war, you wouldn't get the trenches. Conventional doctrine. Therefore, whilst this was an abomination and an act of barbarism, and it most certainly was, it was also conformant to prevailing military doctrine at the time. By 1935, the press is having a field day with the idea of death rays as a way of countering the threat from bombers in the sky that are going to pulverise the civilian population. By 1934, the British state had taken these claims so seriously that it convened a committee. Of course it convened a committee, because that's what governments do. This committee was tasked with exploring the use of radio waves as a directed energy weapon system to boil 8 pints of liquid at an altitude or whatever. In other words, boil the blood out of a human body. They discovered that technically it was feasible, but there were all kinds of problems with aiming and so on and so forth. But they also discovered that, funny old thing, when you bounce radio waves off something in the sky, they bounce back and you can start to read things about distance. Thus radar was born. By 1938, radar is real. Everybody knows war's coming at this point. There are 5 radar stations operational. There's an air exercise in 1938, catastrophe. The bombers get through, the Air Minister himself is wiggly fingers bombed, there he is, before he's bombed, and it's a farce. The radar stations themselves work perfectly, so the technology, flawless. The sociology that would enable the technology to have effect, completely deficient, not there. So, at great speed, this thing, the Dowding system, is created. Dowding didn't create it, didn't invent it, but he's the guy with the gold braid on his hat, so the thing gets named after him. Dowding system is a recognisably modern, informational, socio-technical system in which humans are plumbed into the system in new and radically different ways. These humans are information processing constructs. They are in symbiosis with their electronic equivalents, they are augmented by their electronic equivalents, and they are the functional equivalents of these electronic boxes over here. They are there to process information. They're plumbed into the system. New mechanisms of information and data visualization, telephone lines laid out to grass airfields in the middle of nowhere, and then there's this place, Bletchley Park. A factory, absolutely, processing information in this clerical sense, using recognisably Taylorist and Fordist principles, absolutely. But a factory also in this sense. First the bombs, and then Colossus. These machines are acting on information in a way that had previously been considered the exclusive preserve of the human mind. They're guessing. They're not simply storing it passively, they're not simply retrieving it passively, they're not simply communicating it with fidelity, they are guessing. First electromechanically, and then digitally, electronically. In America, this guy, Norbert Wiener, eminent mathematician working at MIT, receives a contract from this guy, Warren Reaver, who's part of, well, he heads up Section D of the National Defence Research Council, and the contract is to research the mathematics of this, aiming one of these, an anti-aircraft gun, against one of these, which is inhabited by a pilot who most unreasonably doesn't want to get shot down by one of these and takes evasive action, therefore the flight path is non-linear. Not completely boundless because of the limitations of the airframe and the mission, they've got to make progress, but nevertheless, complicated mathematics conducted at speed. Wiener starts to think about the equivalence between humans and machines in these complex systems and starts to puzzle about how you can represent the agency of humans and machines in mathematical terms and how you can fuse them together. By the end of the Second World War, therefore, there are electronic equivalents of the human sensorial system, and these are understood by contemporaries in exactly this way. These are senses. They can see at distances that humans cannot. They augment. There is this, the servo mechanism, an electromechanical, electronic equivalent of not just the musculoskeletal system, but proprioception and kinesthesia. Self-adjusting, self-adapting, self-regulating. Black boxes, that's where the term comes from, originally. And there are these. And in contemporary minds, the idea is emerging that there is a functional equivalence between the way the human neurological system operates and the way that these things operate. This is how they are thinking. And by 1943, this idea had taken root in this paper, written by Warren McCulloch, a psychiatrist, who, let's be clear, was a physicalist, and therefore the psyche is not this immaterial substance for Warren McCulloch. In his work, the mind and the body are literally one and the same, more on that later, and this guy, Walter Pitt's a mathematician. The basic thesis in this paper is that it is possible to create a mathematical model of the operation of the human neurological system, and that the human neurological system functions like a net. That's where the idea of neural networks comes from. This is the birth certificate of modern neural networks. This is where it tracks back to. They understood explicitly the interconnection between their ideas, expressed in this paper, and Turing's seminal work in 1936. They were utterly conscious about the equivalences that they were drawing between their idea of a mathematical model of the neurological system and the capabilities of a Turing machine, and the equivalence. And they understand that they're picking a fight with, let's say, metaphysical notions of mind. They understand that they are getting around the problem of the mind being able to comprehend itself by thinking about the thing that's thinking about the thing that's thinking about the thing, and so on and so forth, by creating first a mathematical analogue and then a functional analogue of the thing that you're studying. In 1943, in Britain, this guy, also an experimental psychologist working in Cambridge, involved in war work, developing the systems that substitute for human cognitive and perceptual agency, and kinesthetic and proprioceptive agency, is starting to theorise about the physical nature of the mind. He writes a book in 1943, Nature of Explanation, in which he posits that the phenomenon of thought is a consequence of the patterns that the neurological system creates, and that the correspondence between those patterns and the world is a consequence of the fact that the neurological system is fundamentally atomistic. They're made of atoms in exactly the same way as the world is. Therefore, just as you can build a physical model of a bridge, you can build a model of the world inside the physicality of the mind. Craig is also articulating the equivalence between the electronic equivalence and the biological equivalence in all these domains: brains, nerves, proprioception, kinesthesia, and so forth. Then there are these two guys working at Bletchley, friends, colleagues. As Jack Good later recalls, in the early 1940s, Turing is already thinking about not merely the abstract implications of electronic machines replicating the phenomenon of human thought, but also the sociological implications of this. And in 1943 we know that Turing spent time with Claude Shannon in America. Turing was in New York at the time to assist the British government in assessing the security of the Sig-Sally system, which Shannon had evaluated mathematically, which gave rise to the mathematical theory of cryptography. We know that Turing met this guy, Tommy Gold, because Tommy Gold, well, according to Tommy Gold's account, he thinks that Turing had found out about the fact that Gold was probably the first person in the world to use mercury delay lines as information storage and retrieval systems in radar during the Second World War. And again, Turing talks to Gold about the sociological implications of a revolution of mind that is to come when the electronic computers that Turing imagines will exist in the world in the post-war period. Gold rather generously gives the idea of the working mercury delay line to Wilkes in Cambridge. And there he is. Let's flip back to America. Warren Weaver gave Wiener the contract to research the mathematics of predictive anti-aircraft flight. Weaver worked for Vannevar Bush, who was the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which during the Second World War brigaded more or less the entirety of the American scientific research and development establishment under military command and control. 6,000 scientists, more or less, give or take, under his direct command and control. The Manhattan Project was just one of Bush's concerns. In 1940, Wiener writes to Bush and says, you know, the war is going to demand machines that are going to demand mathematics, that are going to demand computation, which humans are just not quick enough to do. We're going to have to build machines to do these sums. And he sets out the characteristics of the computers that will be required in 1940. So by the post-war period, guys, none of this is new to the cognoscenti. The idea that it emerges like Minerva in the immediate period after the Second World War is just for the birds. In 1945, Bush, now bear in mind, Bush is the kind of character who, if he whispers, presidents listen. This is not a fringe character. He is not the equivalent of David Icke in his world. This guy is about as mainstream as it gets. He writes an article called As We May Think, first of all in Life, in the Atlantic, and then in Life. He says in this article that human society has become so complex, and the dependence of human society upon information, storage, processing, retrieval, communication together, has become so absolute that unless humans develop machines that augment their mental capacity and enhance their capacity to deal with information, human society will collapse. He says this explicitly. And he says in order to prevent the collapse, we need to develop machines that will do this. So he comes up with the idea of the memex, the memory extender, which will store the entirety of human knowledge. And the memex will be equipped with metal plates, and you can put books down on the metal plates, and the metal plates will scan in. The memex will be able to store video, it'll be able to store audio. These buttons at the bottom can be programmed, and they can be programmed to lead you to addresses within the memory store. But these buttons at the bottom can also create self-associative patterns of information connection within the system. Sound familiar? It's a hyperlink. Tim Berners-Lee did not invent the idea of the hyperlink. He coded it, he brought it to reality, but the idea of the hyperlink tracks back to this paper. There's the voice encoder, GoPro here, no sorry, that's the video encoder. And these machines are all connected to a back-end repository. Go figure. This wasn't a crazy idea in 1944. This thing already existed. Okay, you know, how many angels dance on the head of a pig? Was it Turing complete? Blah, 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 blah. However, it's pretty darn close, at least as far as the contemporaries were concerned. And by 1946, this thing exists. Reprogrammable, not stored program, but otherwise tick, tick, tick. 1946. In 1948, Wiener produces this book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. Arguably the most important book of the 20th century. Had Wiener not written this book, you wouldn't be calling anything cyber. It's where the word comes from. But it's where the phenomenon comes from in far more than name. It continues to astound and distress me that we churn out generations and generations of computer scientists and researchers in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity specialists, so-called, who are unaware of the existence of this book, let alone have read it. In what other field of human endeavour do we permit that level of intellectual poverty and historical ignorance to exist? At the time, notwithstanding the fact that arguably, probably, very few people in this room have heard of the book, hopefully not, I'd be delighted to be proved wrong, this took the world by storm. Initially America, and then it travelled the Atlantic pretty darn quick. Study of vital importance, it became an instant overnight bestseller. It sold like hotcakes despite the publishers and the author's expectations. Badly printed, it's badly proofread, didn't have any index, it contained errors in the mathematical formula, only Turing could understand them, blah, 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 blah. Nevertheless, it took off like crazy. A startling and ominous development in human evolution. Impossible for anybody who claimed any kind of intellectual or cultural credibility to not have read this book. Cybernetics craze swept Galileo, Rousseau, Mill, blah, 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 blah. I lay that on thick because the chances are you've never heard of this book, and the chances are your instinctive reaction to the claim that this is the most important book of the 20th century is, this guy's off his rocker. However, the evidence is there, if one but interrogates it. The book was uncategorizable. This is a delicious letter from the head of the Dewey Decimal Classification System at the Library of Congress to Wiener, whose book was avowedly, well, not just interdisciplinary, it was transdisciplinary. Wiener had no time for academic disciplines, no time for people defending the frontiers of their little bit of turf, no time for the artificial distinctions and the attempts to marginalise through the manipulation of jargon and all that kind of stuff. He thought the most fertile areas were the bits in between. probably right. So the poor librarian says, Professor Wiener, Dr. Wiener, what is this book about? And of course he doesn't answer because he doesn't want to answer. So I'm going to do the impossible now and in about 3 minutes sum up this book, which couldn't be categorised or defined at the time. Of course, this is a ridiculous proposition. I can't do it. I'll just give you the wave-top highlights. So in one sense, it's a study of structures and systems, and it feeds directly into systems theory, although the architect of general systems theory denied the connection, as did Brzezinski in mathematical biological terms, but they're both wrong. It feeds into general systems theory. It's about nonlinear systems, so it's about systems that look like this, or stochastic systems that look like this. It's most definitely not about linear, deterministic, Newtonian systems. And Wiener takes a right old pop at Newton in the book. Absolutely goes for a defenestration. So none of the Laplacian universe, so Wiener's universe is stochastic. Hardly surprising, because Wiener is one of the architects of the mathematics that underpin quantum theory, so this is not a surprising trajectory for him. He talks about the notion of feedback as a causational mechanism, circular causation, therefore no beginning and no end. I beg the obvious question of where do you start and where do you initiate the system, but that's one for a couple of pints of whatever you fancy and a slightly longer conversation, but nevertheless circular causation. So he's picking up on the idea of feedback that was familiar to Nyquist, Bode and Black and also to Shannon, whereas they were interested in it in engineering terms as a mechanism initially for amplifying a telephone signal as it crossed transatlantic distances. Wiener starts to think about it in this causational sense, as a modality of systemic creation, causation, existence. The clicker isn't working. Aha! And it's from Wiener that we get the distinction between the positive and negative feedback loops. Counterintuitively, the positive feedback loop suppresses the cause of the disturbance to the system, the negative feedback loop amplifies the cause of the disturbance to the system. And we've got the spinning wheel of death again. I've killed your computer. Excellent. That's the first time I see the spinning wheel of death in the middle of a PowerPoint slide.
This may say something about the way you use PowerPoint as a replacement for cinema.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so this is an example of an instance where the human neurological system surpasses the electron. There we go. He deploys freely notions from biology, so he borrows notions of homeostasis from Walter Cannon. This is going to get terribly tedious, isn't it? Danny, any ideas? Mine!
That was what I was going to say. The PowerPoint download on the machine, or is it trying to get from you?
I don't know. Madam, what's the score with the PowerPoint? Is it?
It's on the machine, it should work.
Entertain yourselves for a second.
It's not downloaded, it might take a while.
Yeah.
It's called PowerPoint. Let's rewind to one of the other settings. Talk about human machine experience. How's that work? How's the human machine team working here?
Well, I had to put my back up because Colin, I said, Colin, where are you? I haven't had a reply this morning, so I thought, oh my God, is he stuck somewhere? So, under 2020, we had to do things remotely. So I actually got a recording on an earlier version of this. You don't get royalties rather than as a full thing.
Yay! Excellent. Splendid. We're cooking on gas. Ignore that short hiatus. So, the notion of homeostasis, therefore, feeding directly into ideas of dynamic equilibrium as opposed to static equilibrium, like that, blah blah blah, self-adaptive systems, self-regulating systems, self-governing systems, brackets, when you start thinking about the way in which cybersecurity, for instance, and system design has to go. Do you want systems which are predicated on that kind of balancey stability like that, or like that? Well, you want systems that are like that. Where's the theoretical foundation of systems that look like that? In cybernetics. And when you start thinking about swarms and self-adaptive metasystems like this, then you're back in the realm of cybernetics and the predicates that Wiener was dealing with at the time. Wiener also feeds directly into ideas, theoretical underpinnings of ideas, in which the notion of system is itself an arbitrary concept. It's a consequence of observation. Now, brackets, in my day job, this is profoundly important because we still have people who idiotically argue that the predicate of cybersecurity is know your system. Honestly? Come on. And that you can't do cybersecurity unless you build an ontology of the system. If ever there was a misguided appropriation of a term from philosophy to science, it's the use of the term ontology when it comes to mapping out a computer network. What happens at the edge here? Oh, it connects to something else. You go, no, that's outside the scope. Oh, really? Excellent. Stuxnet. Now, I'm getting off. Stuxnet. The network that Stuxnet infected was air isolated. It was supposed to be impenetrable. What happened? It wasn't. Stuxnet got on. How? Don't know, go figure. However, even more interesting, how did we find out about Stuxnet? It got out. Now, okay, I'll buy somebody idiotically put a USB stick. Oh, what's that? Huh, stick, bang, boom. It got out the same way? I don't think so. So much for an air-gap network. Forget about it. So, Wiener gives us the theoretical underpinnings of the notion, you know, what's the system here? Yeah, the human, the latter systems, because there's all kinds of organs and whatnots in there. The spade, yeah, that's part of the system. The ground, yeah, that's part of the system. So now the composition of the ground is important. So now rainfall's important. So now the climate's part of your system. Now time's part of it. Where's the system? Wherever the heck you say it is. System definition is arbitrary. And for those of you who have a certain inclination, this is where the OODA loop comes from, and Boyd, the US colonel who coined the idea of the OODA loop, did read Wiener and was aware of cybernetics. It's a cybernetical. Wiener also deploys the notion of information, and here there's a really interesting kind of sociological thing in which Wiener and Shannon agree that they independently authored the idea. Although Wiener reckons he really did it, and Shannon snuck into his lectures and nicked some of his ideas in the original authorship. But hey, we'll leave that to a scientific priority argument. So this is obviously the picture from Shannon's original formulation, and you can see the relationship to cryptography. I have plain text, I introduce randomness that mushes it up, I transmit it, I want the randomness out so I can get the mush back into the plain text, voila, the basis of information theory in the Shannon sense. Wiener's coming at it in a slightly different perspective. Boy, I wish I'd bought one earlier. That's how much those things are worth now, my gosh. This guy, Warren Reaver, who you will remember gave the contract to Norbert Wiener to write the paper, well, he writes the introduction to the book which popularises Shannon's version of information theory, and he writes the sociological dimension to it, whereas Shannon is talking simply about the communications. Both Wiener and Shannon have exactly the same idea of entropy, exactly the same mathematical formula, they just have a plus and minus in a different direction. For one, information is the presence of entropy, the other, it's the same. So whereas Shannon is deeply concerned with serving the interests of his masters, fair enough, and figuring out the mathematical underpinnings for the engineering that's going to enable Marbell to continue its conquest of the communication systems in the United States of America, Wiener's thinking about information as a control mechanism. In ways that we haven't got time to discuss, as in, obviously there's clearly a sense in which a single binary digit in something that we might call an ICS system can execute massive effect, totally disproportionate to the energy budget of a single binary digit. But there's also other ways in which Wiener is thinking about information as a communication system. And there we get into the perennial argument which is raised ever since Shannon published this book and Wiener published Cybernetics, which is how can you reconcile their mathematical notion of information, which is based on the probability of the whatever outcome, with the idea that information is not information without the content. We haven't got time to go into that. However, Wiener extends the idea of information as a control mechanism to the way in which humans interact and humans construct themselves socially. So he posits that information is a control mechanism within society. Sound really contemporary? And people's anxieties about the use of information as a mechanism for controlling elections and all the rest of it tracks directly back to Wiener. thesis of this book, which is the human use of human beings, that society can only be understood through a study of the messages and communications that specifically belong to it. And that in the future, development of these messages and communication facilities between man and machines, between machines and man, and between machine and machine are destined to play an ever-increasing part. We should have seen this coming, because Wiener told us it was coming. This should not have come as a shock to us. You recognise this guy? Yeah. The medium is the message, influenced by cybernetics. How do we know? Because he wrote the foreword to this book called Cybernetics Simplified by a chap called Arthur Porter, who knew Wiener and who worked at Scrivener. Did our Arthur? Wiener goes further, and this is going to become considerably more important in a moment. Wiener posits that his theory permits humanity to build synthetic beings. When Wiener talks about the electronic equivalence between, or the equivalence between electronics and the human neurological system, he isn't talking about abstract boxes that sit in a desk, on a desk, or frames full of valves that sit in a room. He is talking about building synthetic beings that exist in the world, interact with the world, interact with their environment, are acted upon by their environment, that can experience phenomenological subjectivity. He gets into the whole Bergsonian thing. He argues that there is absolutely nothing of which the human physiological form, specifically neurological and electrochemical and hormonal, nothing of which that form is capable that cannot be replicated. And therefore, a new form of being created. He thinks he's cracked the secret of life. Literally. He talks about being able to render humans into their informational form, transmit them electronically, and reconstruct them at the other end. A bit like a three-dimensional printer and scanner, really, connected to the internet. He posits that there is no difference between the meat and the metal in the system, and he extends the notion of equivalence in ways that we've just discussed. He understands, absolutely, that he is picking a fight with one of humanity's most cherished notions, that there is something special about us as humans. There's something unique about us as humans. There's something which we can do, or property or attributes that we have, that no synthetic construct can ever replicate. And he knows he's picking a fight specifically with Descartes and the idea of the immaterial mind, the separation between the substance of the mind and the substance of the body, although the mind is an immaterial substance, nevertheless it is substantively different. And his contemporaries understand this too. So to the extent that cybernetics tends to percolate into the academic consciousness in contemporary terms, it's in an incredibly reductive sense, oh, it's all to do with control systems, it's all to do with ICSs, whatever, whatever, whatever. No, in its original conception, it was far grander than that. Far grander than that. 1947, before he writes Cybernetics, Wiener comes over to Britain, meets Turing at the National Physical Laboratory, and decides, quite rightly, that Turing and he are very much on the same page. Absolutely. Absolutely. Was Turing a cyberneticist? No, absolutely not. Was Turing, however, involved in the same sociology as Wiener? Yes. And was Turing aligned to Wiener's ideas about the fundamental equivalence between a synthetic being and a human being? Absolutely no question. Absolutely no question. Turing goes on to join the Ratio Club, a gathering of British cyberneticists. There they are in all the glory. Still annoys me, I can't find a photograph of Victor Little, but anyway, I'll keep on trying. 1946, this happens. Lord Mountbatten, of all people, gives a speech. British Institution of Radio Engineers, they expect they're going to be told, you've done a great job, carry on, you've done radar, you've won the war, they get some of that, and then Mountbatten goes off on one and starts to talk about ENIAC, this American computer which will emulate human minds, to which humans will be connected directly and electronically in symbiotic form, and these things will govern global telecommunications networks in a form we have not yet seen. He is talking about MEMEX as well as ENIAC, although he doesn't name it by name, but he read the newspaper reports, he clearly is. Instantly there's a mass pile-on. Instantly the scientific establishment rise up within days and declare the noble lord to be a complete idiot. Computers are just machines for doing sums, lad. Without the human brain that programs them, they're meaningless. They just take away the rote drudgery of computation. It's our genius that matters. Hartree piles on. Darwin piles on. Wilkes piles on. And alas, for those of you of this parish, so do these two. Spoiler alert, these two do not come out of the story well at all. At all. They are articulating what Turing himself would later call the Ada Lovelace objection in the famous 1950 paper that lots of people quote and refer to and very few people have actually read, sadly, because it generally doesn't say what people think it says. Turing is dragged in from the very start. So, here we go, myth busting. The idea that in 1945-46 Turing's work with Colossus was so secret that his contemporaries did not recognise his paternity of the computer is false. They did. They were quoting his 1936 paper and referring back to it at this time. They were referencing his authorship of the design of the ace that was going to be the plucky British answer to the ENIAC, which was offending British national pride as much as anything else. The public knew about Turing's involvement, as did his contemporaries. Maurice Wilkes attempts to wrest control of one of the first research contracts to produce the ace from the National Physical Laboratory. He submits his design to the NPL. The NPL give it to Turing to review. Turing savages the design. Wilkes doesn't get the contract. Wilkes never forgave Turing, ever, for that savaging. 1948, Wiener produces cybernetics. That reignites the debate that Mountbatten had sparked in 1946. Now, this debate raged across the BBC, across the airwaves, across the British popular press. It's phenomenal. If you trawl the archives and look at the instances of the cultural manifestation of this debate, which I have done, it is phenomenal. In 1949, this guy, Jefferson, a neurosurgeon, here at Manchester, wins, well, in 1948 he wins the Lister Medal for being good at cutting people up. In 1949, he gives the mandatory oration on the mind of mechanical man. He goes for Turing, he goes for cybernetics, he goes for the idea that humans are, well, he supports the idea that humans are exceptional, he bolsters the commonsensical idea that respectable science and respectable scientists say that machines can never emulate human thought because that's secret special, that's something that only humans can do. He knows exactly what he's doing. And look, the chronology here is vitally important. Within days, these guys are piled on. Read this article, they're taking a pop at Turing right the way through, directly. Turing is a heretic. Turing, so for these guys, they can denigrate non-mathematicians, like Mountbatten. They can denigrate the public because they know no better, bless them. They're not proper scientists like what they are. So they don't know that computers can't think. Turing, they've got a problem. He's a mathematician, right? He's one of them. And he invented the darn thing. And he will not recant his heresy. And he calls himself a heretic. He will not back down from the idea that computers can think. Gilbert Ryle is implicated in this debate. Why is that important? Well, he writes this book called The Concept of Mind, which is where we get the notion of the Cartesian ghost, because he goes for Descartes and defenestrates Descartes, and he's part of this public philosophical debate. This is based on a series of BBC talks which go for cybernetics. Why do you think Turing published this paper in Mind? Mind is a journal of philosophy. He published it because he's mates with Ryle, and that, well, at least they're allies in the same debate. There's letters in the archive between Ryle and Turing. Turing responds to Ryle, which is quite remarkable because Turing never responded to anybody. Even his friends sent him the equivalent of stamped addressed envelopes because he was notoriously rubbish at replying. So there's clearly, if you like, a meeting of minds, pun intended. The idea that Turing just happened, like Minerva, to produce this paper out of nowhere as an expression of Archimedean genius, and he leapt out of the bathroom and said, "Eureka! I've had this idea of thinking." It's because he was a protagonist in this public debate about thinking machines in which he would not back down. And boy, did he pay a heavy price for it. So these are just some of the instances where Turing can be identified as a protagonist in the debate. And in these instances, where there are multiple players in the same series, basically it's a mass pile-up, he's been set up, and they're all ganging up on him. And there you go, there's Williams, and there's Hartley, and there's Wilkes, and there's Jefferson, And there's Newman. That's a fairly heavyweight bunch of protagonists. However, notwithstanding that antipathy from the scientific and the nascent computing establishment, who, by the way, are in the process of carving out their discipline, identifying and demarcating their turf and denying others access to it on terms of their own choosing, plus the change, these guys, Turing's contemporaries in the Ratio Club and elsewhere, well, they're expressing in practice the idea that you can build physical analogues of the neurological system which can demonstrate equivalence and in some cases surpass the capabilities of their biological counterparts. So this, the homeostatic mechanism that displays homeostatic properties, in other words adaptive environmental adaptation. This guy grey water produces his tortoises which have no code, no programming, 2 neurons, a couple of senses and exhibit self-adaptive behaviour. They mimic life. Every robot vacuum cleaner you see, every robot hoover you see is based on these ideas, because Rodney Brooks discovered Grey-Walter's work and went on to found the company Roomba. These things become a celebrity. Festival of Britain, blah, 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 blah. At the National Physical Laboratory, and by the way, Utley is ousted from the National Physical Laboratory because he too commits the biological heresy, and according to the sentiments of his colleagues, he isn't hard enough in his science, he's not mathematical enough, and he is susceptible to the idea that computers can think. He builds a conditional probability computer connected to a robot, so what? The computer isn't actually intended to calculate conditional probabilities for their own sake, it uses conditional probabilities as a learning mechanism. The robot isn't programmed, it self-learns. And he's deliberately attempting to emulate the operation of the biological synapses with their conditional firing. To be clear, Turing and Wiener and Utley and all of the rest of them are not interested in running software equivalents, Turing machines if you like, inside Turing machines. They're not interested in using electronics to host an algorithmic recreation of a biological phenomenon. They're interested in building electronics to replicate the biological form. Direct equivalent beings. 1958, this guy builds a perceptron, Rosenblatt. Details are hard to come by, but it is an optical sensing mechanism, probably connected to a physical neural network, connected to a computer. Self-learns. You don't have to show 1,000 pictures of a cat. It self-learns. And there we go, recognisable picture. In 1956, this guy, bright, young, aggressive American mathematician, carving out his career, decides he's going to survey the art of the big thing at the moment, which is the project to synthesize human cognition. So he surveys the art, produces this, the landmark study that contains 4 papers by members of the Ratio Club, Turing's colleagues, all cyberneticists. Read the introduction to this. McCarthy doesn't like this idea at all, hates it, hates anything to do with cybernetics. Note he's brigaded Shannon to give him air cover, plus a change, because at this point McCarthy's an unknown. So, at the same time as he's editing this volume, he drafts the proposal for the Dartmouth Summer School, 1956, very famous, we all know about it. It's the paternal birthplace of AI, McCarthy is the father of AI, yada yada yada. Yeah, kind of true. He does coin the term artificial intelligence. Well, actually that's disputed by Woodward, who was a member of the Ratio Club, who reckons he coined the term and McCarthy nicked it, but anyway that's disputed by McCarthy's acolytes. I can tell you that Ross Ashton was there, and he was set up. At least one of the members of the Ratio Club was invited, may or may not have attended, the records aren't very clear. This was, of course, McCarthy's predicate. That you can replicate the entire phenomenon of human intelligence, whatever that is, algorithmically, reductionist. There was another motive McCarthy had, which he did not articulate until the publication of this in 1987. The construction of artificial intelligence, the formulation of the mathematical algorithmic predicate, was McCarthy's covert attempt to conquer, defeat, sideline, marginalise cybernetics. Hated the idea. Didn't want to contest Wiener. Fair enough. Didn't want to argue with him in public. Not fair enough, John. That's not the way the academy works. And he knew that what he was doing was counter to what he considered to be the deviant orthodoxy. You can read it for yourself. So for McCarthy, none of this idea, none of what we would call connectionism, embodied networks, outsourced mind, embodied intelligence, outsourced mind. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. All nice, neat, algorithmic, linear, blah, 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 blah. Go fine. Didn't work. We know it didn't work. Environmental disturbance, breaks it. Combinatorial explosion, breaks it. Any degradation in the mechanics of this, break it. Has no self-adaptive capacity. And that's not how you work. When you pick up a pencil, you don't run a pre-scripted algorithm, you sense, adapt, adjust in a cybernetic sense. In fact, that's what Wheeler uses in cybernetics as the example. We knew in 1973 many of these problems because Lighthill articulated them. Lighthill wasn't against the idea of synthetic constructs emulating human intelligence, whatever that is. He was pointing out the deficiencies in McCarthy's work. McCarthy stamps his petulant little foot, hoists himself across the Atlantic, demands satisfaction, and initiates the debate on the BBC, where he says to James Lighthill, who at this point is the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, that Lighthill isn't sufficiently mathematically qualified to contest John McCarthy's thesis. It's a bold statement. And it's the fundamental flaw in the McCarthyite predicate that gives us the cycle of AI winters that we've experienced. It took us down a rabbit hole, yada, yada, yada. In the United Kingdom, cybernetics didn't fare terribly well. It fared somewhat better in the States, at least initially, notwithstanding the success of people like Ashby, partly because the post-war period was characterised, I mean, it's not exhaustive, but partly because the post-war period was characterised by a crisis of humanism in the United Kingdom. The barbarism of war had summoned forth barbarism in order to defeat it, and therefore, if you stare too long into the abyss, you become the monster, and Dresden and all the rest of it. So there was that crisis of humanism, and there was also a crisis of, if you like, confidence. The empire was disintegrating, Britain was bankrupt, and there was a kind of retrenchment into orthodoxy, and the idea that humans would be replaced by machines was going to violate the fundamental tenet of the post-war social contract that was full employment and all the rest of it. So it didn't go very far. In the Soviet Union, 1950, Wiener's work is decried. These are all these fleshy and he smokes cigars. You can see why the Soviets would denounce it in the sense of it's a tool of capitalism, it subjugates humans to the status of robots, blah, 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 blah. 1956, Khrushchev's secret speech, cybernetics is rehabilitated in all but name. Becomes an official Soviet science. Wiener gets to spend time in the United States, rare at the time. Ashby's books sell so well that he has to travel to the Soviet Union to spend the rubles because he can't bring them out of the Soviet Union. I've found this so far, and I've kind of drawn a halt for obvious reasons, but we know that there was an enormous investment institutionally and in terms of the state in cybernetics in the Soviet Union. Massive institutes devoted to research and development in cybernetics, including this, the Estonian Cybernetics Research Institute, which morphs into Cybernetica. I know that because I've interviewed some of the directors, and they were directors of the Soviet Research Institute as well. So how is it that the Estonians were able to defend against the bronze statue attack? We're looking at it, cybernetics. Why is Estonia everything as far as whatever is concerned? The cybernetic legacy. And if you look at the Russian sociological, political, economic, military elite, well, look, you find cybernetics just about everywhere. And of course, this guy is a former KGB agent, will know all of that. 1957, Sputnik. Americans go into a metaphysical funk, not because of Soviet missile bases on the moon, but because, well, nuclear Armageddon raining down from the moon. The beginning of the space race. Forget the final frontier. This is a project to get humans, American humans, onto the moon to deny the Soviets the ability to put nuclear missiles on the moon. School of Aerospace Medicine, Brooks Air Force Base, 1960. These two produce a paper, Drug, Space and Cybernetics, Evolution to Cyborgs. This is where cyborg comes from. It's not a construct of science fiction, it's a construct of scientific theory. Evolution is too darn slow. You need to take cybernetics, you need to fuse it corporeally with humans, you need to augment human senses and human perception, and you need to create beings that can exist in the vacuum and hostility of space without a spacesuit or a tin can enclosing the Earth atmosphere. That's the way they crack it. NASA never forgot the cyborg. This is the cybernetic organism, the cyborg. Exogenic autonomic. This is the definition of the cyborg in the original paper. It doesn't have to be mechanical or electronic, but typically that's what people think of. Grab evolution by the scruff of the neck and drag it forward. Fast forward to today. The biohackers, bless them. They're doing exactly this. They are a fringe community, obviously. Nothing to do with any of us, and we need not bother with them. If only, imagine, somebody with their hands on the levers of power, or at least proximate to the people with their hands on the levers of power, had come up with the idea that you might want to cybernetically fuse the human neurological system with the computational backbone upon which human civilization depends for its existence. Crazy idea, right? Never going to happen. Couldn't possibly work, because there's no prospect of equivalence between these things and the neurological system, except it does. And we haven't got time to go off on the whole transhumanism trail, but clearly I'm signposting it for the avoidance of death. Not a marginal character at all. This is nice, we like this. We use cybernetic augmentation to bail us out of the mess that we created when a nuclear power station went bang in a way that it shouldn't. That's lovely. How do you think about that? What do you think about that? How's that then? DARPA was one of the 2 agencies that the United States government created in the aftermath of the launch of Sputnik to make sure that America never fell behind in the technological race with its adversaries. The other one was NASA, which never forgot the cyborg life. Forget the Internet of Things. Next phase, Internet humans. Call it what you will. I'm calling it, I'm claiming it, I'm owning it. Humans connected directly to the great interconnectedness of everything. Exactly as Mountbatten foresaw in 1946. Exactly as Mountbatten foresaw in 1946. Those who know not their history are condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. Colin Warwick, some point, whenever this was about earlier, 2008, took a bit of a rat brain, put it in a bell jar, on a bench, of course it was a bell jar, connected it by Bluetooth to a robot, and the cells of the rat brain controlled the robot. No programming, no scripting. So, you're all human, right? How much of the meat goes into the metal? How much of the metal goes into the meat before that boundary ceases to be meaningful? We are, of course, in the realm of the venerable philosopher Trigger and his broom. If you want a slightly more academically sound version, the grandfather's axe, that's what it's called, or the classical origin, the ship of Theseus, where his followers replace all of the planks and they say, there you go, boss, we've rebuilt the ship. Not my ship, says Theseus. Why not, they say. Look, and off you go. It's a great game for philosophy for undergraduates. What do you want? Is your claim, if indeed you have it, you may not, to human exceptionalism based on the material form of the substrate? Is it based on some particular characteristic of some particular organ? You like the squishiness? That's great, I'll grow it. I'll print it. That's groovy. I'll print the entire body if you like. It's only a matter of time. However, no matter how much it looks like a parrot, as Descartes would have said, without the soul, the substantive but immaterial soul, can't possibly be. Right? Which soul? Whose soul? It's not the only show in town. Not by a long chalk. So if you haven't got a soul from this character, does that mean you're one of them? Uncomfortable, isn't it? Previously, this has all been the realm of fiction. It's not anymore. The stuff that's got people excited, generative neural network, pre-trained transformers, well, that's a teachy departure from McCarthy's original predicate. Or to put it another way, they've been constructed using a fraction of the intellectual and scientific legacy of cybernetics. Imagine what might happen if more of the legacy of cybernetics is deployed. And we not only marginally reverse McCarthy's algorithmic idiocy, but we start to develop the models that Wiener and his cohorts originally imagined. In the here and now, already these generative constructs have broken notions of recursive decomposition. I want explainable AI. I'm going to lift the lid off and I'm going to... No, you're not. You're not going to recursively track your way back through the decision making. So when we conflate safe AI with explainable AI with an algorithmic deterministic predicate, which exhibits this Newtonian property of the time invariant, we're beyond that. And we're going to get even further beyond it as we get deeper into the legacy of cybernetics. I went to a conference organised by a government research agency not so very long ago, and they were contending with how do we get beyond the problem of the von Neumann bottleneck before quantum? How do we get beyond the limitations of the von Neumann architecture in computational terms, because we've already got more compute, the demands on our compute are greater than the von Neumann architecture. And they came up with a whole load of really, often quite interesting projects. Every single one of them, literally every single one of them, tracked back to cybernetics. Only they didn't know it. Not one of them. And, moreover, although they were interesting and they tracked back to cybernetics, it was kind of like cybernetics light. None of it was very sophisticated compared to the original models which they were unknowingly invoking. In other words, there's something about the times which is drawing forth. So, if Wiener's right, and if Turing's right, for that matter, in the 1950 paper, and if there is no rational basis for human exceptionalism, then what of the notion of humans and human rights? Law contains many, many, many instances of legal definitions, characterizations and deployments of the idea of non-human persons. Chips, computers, whatever. I've yet to find a legal definition of human. Why does that matter? Well, because you've got close quarters visceral combat between two augmented human beings, cyborgs, let's call them, or a non-cyborg and a cyborg, and the non-cyborg causes the cyborg to cease to exist, but they do so in a way that would break the laws of war. They've committed a war crime. And their defence is, no, I haven't. Because that creature, that monster, isn't human. It's 80% machine. How dare you call that abomination human? Does that say? Definition of human? In legal terms? And there are people on the planet already, transhumanists, brackets, haven't got time to talk about them, who are already positing the idea that non-human, sentient, sapient entities have rights. And in our law, in the United Kingdom, certainly in England, we recognise dogs, animals, but specifically dogs, as being sentient. Because it's illegal to be cruel. Because they exhibit behaviours commensurate with the desire to avoid pain. So, to end on a cheerful note, I offer you a word of advice. From this point hence, be really, 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 really polite to your toasters. Because silicon has an incredibly long memory. Done?
Slightly over, but can we allow five minutes for questions?
Yeah, I remember he said
Yeah, I saw that.
Are we too starting for questions?
yeah.
Yeah, we're still good for questions.
Questions? Yeah? No?
So, Colin,
Go on, George.
all right, so taking your theory to its ultimate conclusion, and you were talking about the conflict between the human form and the cyborg form, and not being cruel to cyborg form. If conflict is about cognitive change, if we are all end up in the form of a machine or mostly machine, then there'll be nothing to cognitively change because we will come to stasis. So your theory will end conflict, potentially.
Possibly. Possibly. There is that sense in which the thermodynamic notion of entropy could transpose into this system, yeah. Absolutely. Wouldn't be the first time in the history of this planet that...
Because machines don't create conflict against machines. Machines create conflict in order to further human endeavour.
Unless, cognizant of precisely that risk, the cognition of this entity decided that it was a good idea to artificially induce conflict in some form or another, precisely to avoid the outcome. In exactly the same way, perhaps, by analogue, we do with sport. Sport is precisely consciously induced conflict, right? We do it precisely and specifically in order to fight realm that's bounded by rules, where the liabilities are limited, where the consequences are constrained. Now,
It's human endeavour.
correct. Correct. But that human endeavour is possibly a product of, for the sake of a shorthand, rationality, as opposed to an innate vitalist property, which can only exist in humans. In other words, insofar as that capacity exists, and it can be manifested by the thing we call human, following the same logic as you've done quite rightly, there is absolutely no reason to presuppose that the synthetic entity could not exhibit exactly the same phenomenon. In fact, there's a very interesting short story by Isaac Asimov called The Inevitable Conflict, in which there is a computer that rules the world, everything is perfect, everything is just absolutely hunky-dory, there's no conflict anymore. And there is precisely that danger of entropy. So the computer consciously stimulates human resistance to its rule in order to counter. So
That's the Matrix. Where
I knew somebody was going to.
well, no,
We're all
the
living in
very
a
purpose.
computational construct.
Let's leave aside we're all living in simulation. You can't disprove that anyway. So, and the good argument against why we're not living in simulation because it'd be better than this. That's the very argument that's advanced in the Matrix. The humans cannot cope with perfection.
But this is just Hegel, right?
Yeah.
It's the Novellans, the Daleks. So,
Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah, so I just about the definition of human. I mean, there are ways there are places in law and elsewhere where definitions of human are thriving, embedded, right? So you can take any culture or society, and humans are defined by not being machines. They're not supernatural. They're not animals. But where we have sort of liminal discussions are over things like fetuses. Infants, people who've got severe mental disability. So one of the, I suppose, if and when we get around to seriously discussing the rights of machines, we've got a vast array of experience in the Judeo-Christian tradition of thinking about some of these things. So we're not coming to this sort of without a background.
No, we're not. And just to pick on one dimension of that, it's one thing to define something oppositionally.
Yeah.
It's another to define the as-isness of that thing in a more classical ontological term. However, I fundamentally agree in that we are not without a stock of knowledge and wisdom in its conventional sense to which we can turn in apprehending and contending and grappling with the problem. Our problem is if we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of thinking that this entire stuff, the entire realm of stuff, is simply a branch of applied mathematics or subject to scientific blah 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 blah. Unless we get stuck into, for the sake of the shorthand, accepting the demarcations, the philosophy, the sociology, the anthropology, you know, whatever you want to call it, as we get stuck into that stuff, then the kinds of questions that you've both raised, we have absolutely no chance of contending with. And that's one of my beefs with McCarthy. The entire project to appropriate the synthesis of human cognition as a branch of applied mathematics was cretinous. How can it be? I mean, it's self-evidently dumb. You want something that emulates the biological form. So you write a script, you stick it in a box, you deny it any of the sensorial connections to the outside. It's not going to work. So, if we made these mistakes with computers and computation and computing across society, we made these mistakes back in the day with cyber, because I lost track of the number of conferences I went to where I said, you can't do cybersecurity unless you can code. Idiot. You can't do cybersecurity, it's STEM. No, it's not STEM. STEM's part of it. Okay, that was pretty consequential. You know, why do you think we keep getting clobbered? Marks and Spencer. Up the yin-yang with certifications. Up the yin-yang with firewalls, blah, blah, blah. You know, I don't know for sure because I haven't been in the scene, but Marks and Spencer's, right, they're a company that do it right, or do the right. We got clobbered. How? Because we've designed rubbish systems. How do I know we've designed rubbish systems? Because kids can break them. That's a rubbish system. So, unless we learn those lessons and start to deploy precisely these kinds of intellectual modalities, history, philosophy, so blah, 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 we have no chance of designing or exercising agency in the design of the socio-technical constructs upon which our society depends. The reason I invoke the Dowding system is not just because it's one of the first, probably the first example of that kind of synthetic interconnection and symbiotic interconnection between humans and machines in an informational system. The reason I invoked it, as well as that, is to illustrate the point that it was the socio-technical nature of that system which generated the effect. In other words, the radar by itself was useless. Devoid the sociology, forget it.
I think we'll still be able to continue these discussions for a while over the tea and coffee. I was certainly pleased as soon as you brought up that slide at the beginning with the K1 robot, and you can talk to me at coffee if you want to know what the K stands for. K1 came before came after K9. No, it was before.
No, it was before.
It was before. You're right. Of course it was. Anyway, so one of the things that came before as well was I remember the first time Colin came and gave a lecture, and he had all the students shuffling because he asked them whether they were completely human. Of course, they thought they were, and then he asked them to put their hands up as to how many of them actually had fillings. So that's certainly a thought to go for. Also a thought of kind of how many slides you can actually fit into a lecture. I find that inspiring. I have used pictorial stuff because I put it in thinking this is a really clever idea, and then of course you talk to an audience and you get to the stage where you're trying to think of why did I put that particular image in. There you go. Another, as well as the Stafford Beer call out, I think again this is hallowed ground. There are 21 academic centres of excellence for cybersecurity research. Recognised by GCHQ in the UK, GCHQ and EPSRC. Only one of them is actually led by a School of Social Science, and it's Manchester. So particularly proud of our Centre for Digital Trust and Society, which kind of helps to catalyse kind of these kind of talks. I think Colin also should not be so modest not to mention that he has been part of the team that has helped to reboot the Ratio Club. We've had a couple of outings, not for a while, partly because of COVID, but partly because the third one was cancelled because Big Ed here got a promotion and needed to write a lecture. So all roads led to me on that particular occasion. I do apologise. Like I say, I've seen this lecture, and I don't know how, so many different forms over the years. I'm still finding myself writing notes and new reading to go out and find, which is really what it's all about. It's not about boiling things down. It's actually about boiling things up and being able to capture some of the steam and the heat. Steam, yeah, it's not STEM, it's steam, isn't it? Fantastic. So anyway, please show your appreciation, please continue the discussions, and like spread the word. I think the most, I think it was like my lecture about, I was liken this to the opening lecture on quantum mechanics when I did my first degree at what was then Manchester Poly. I know I don't look that old. Where the lecturer said, it's not understanding, it's believing. And I think if you get the belief in place, then you can actually move forward with this concept. So, Colin, thanks so much.